Okay, hello again, everybody. We're back after our short intermission. Welcome. I'm Dustin Siebel. I, together with Arthur Meltzer, as you know, co-direct the LeFrak Forum. This is our final panel of the day and our final panel of the conference, sadly. The theme is the question, what is to be done about free speech on campus? And we have two paper presenters. Nancy Costello is Associate Clinical Professor of Law at MSU, and Jonathan Friedman is the Director of the Free Expression and Education at Penn America. So you guys can each take 30 minutes or if need be a little more and have your say, and then we'll let you discuss amongst yourselves and appeal to the audience. Attendees, if you'd like to participate, please type your questions into the Q&A function. Don't raise your hand and don't use the chat. Q&A function is desirable. All right, Nancy.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I thought I would explain a little bit about who I am and what I do, because I'm not one of the well-known published authors at this esteemed conference. I'm a clinical professor of law at MSU College of Law. More to the point, though, I'm also the director of the First Amendment Clinic at MSU Law. That's not where I started. I started as a newspaper reporter for about 15 years of my life, working for the Associated Press, the Detroit Free Press, the Harvard University News Office, and some other smaller newspapers. As an attorney, I practiced for a while, and then when I became a professor, I started the First Amendment Law Clinic about 11 years ago at MSU. And what it does, it's a little different than what happens elsewhere in the country. It's a clinic that focuses on student speech and student press rights. What I do is I train about 12 law students in a given semester, and I train them in First Amendment law and a few other subjects. We look at First Amendment, we look at student speech, we look a lot at social media speech and social media law, copyright law, libel law, privacy law, Freedom of Information Act. My students get trained in these areas, they put together lesson plans, and then they go off to Michigan high schools and they train high school journalists, broadcasters, newspaper reporters, yearbook folks, also government classes of high school students. In the last 11 years, we've trained about 11,000 high school students at about 45 Michigan high schools. And it's not just in one workshop. These workshops stretch. We do 8 workshops at every school. So each one of these students has gotten trained with 8 different First Amendment workshops. It's been pretty fascinating. I also, out of what has grown out of this is the Mcclellan Free Speech Online Library, which I supervise. And that is a website that is dedicated to the free speech and free press rights of 14 to 21-year-olds. We get questions from across the country about free speech rights from individuals about this age, and then within a certain length of time, we get back to them, do some legal research, and try to respond to their questions about their free speech rights, different kind of censoring problems that they've had, et cetera. So when Arthur asked me to do this conference, and he asked me to do one of the closing remarks on this, I think the reason he asked me was he wanted me to give you sort of a view from the trenches of teaching First Amendment law, and also how young people then take these free speech principles and how do they apply them, or how don't they apply them. And specifically, I'm looking at individuals in secondary schools, high schools here. In short, young people know very little about their free speech rights, and that's what I've discovered over the last 11 years. And if we want to see more diversity of viewpoint at the college level and more acceptance of different viewpoints, I don't think that we can wait until a person turns 18 to teach them or hope that they get into college and they learn this. It's not magic. This just doesn't, like, people just don't suddenly understand at age 18, I have free speech rights and I can go out there and be a rabble rouser or speak my mind. We need to teach individuals a lot younger than that if we really hope that they understand free speech rights and that they use them and employ them, and that we would have a diversity of viewpoints in colleges and elsewhere when the kids get out of high school. There's 2 points I want to talk about in my talk. The first one is what I just mentioned, that we have to teach First Amendment free speech principles to individuals at a much younger age if we want these values to really take hold. And the second thing I want to talk about is that given that a primary mode of communication has radically changed in the last 10 to 12 years, especially for young people, I believe that we have to deliberately teach young people how to engage in civil, respectful, face-to-face discourse in a way that we never had to do it to the degree that we need to do it now. First of all, let me talk about the First Amendment principles. In a 2018 Knight Foundation survey of almost 10,000 high school students, 89% of these students said they supported the right to express unpopular opinions. In the exact same survey, though, only 45% of those same students believed people have the right to speech that others considered offensive. So this seems to be a contradictory finding, right? And the contradictory survey results has been analyzed as a demonstration of the conflict between free press protections and the values of diversity and inclusion. Now, that's a pretty nuanced analysis, and it could be right. I think another less nuanced analysis is that young people simply do not understand their free speech rights. This is what I've noticed in the last 11 years. In another survey, it's an annual survey done by the Freedom Forum Institute that investigates attitudes towards the First Amendment. About 1,000 people a year are interviewed and surveyed. A question asked whether students should be allowed to express their opinions on social media without worrying about being punished by teachers or school administrators for what they say. 72% of those surveyed agreed that students should be able to post on social media without being afraid of retaliation. Now that's interesting. I also thought it might have been like an indignant response that they thought that they would be punished for it, when in fact, students have every right to say something that they want to on social media about their teachers or their principals. One of my favorite moments over the last 11 years in these First Amendment workshops is when we go in to teach the high school students what their free speech rights are, we ask them if they think that they have the right to criticize their teachers or their principals on social media or in other forms of speech. Students routinely say no, and teachers agree with this. And then their eyes get very wide when either myself or my students tell them that they point out that, in fact, the First Amendment principles protect speech that criticizes the government, and they have the right to criticize their teachers and their principals because their teachers and their principals at public high schools are the government. Teachers never think about this. They don't think about themselves as the government at these public high schools. And so when I say that, the highest form, the most highly protected speech is political speech, of course. So when you are criticizing a high school official, you're criticizing the government. It's highly protected speech. And the teachers just look at me blankly that they never understood that this was really possible before. Now, of course, we always back this up with how should we express these opinions or this type of speech that we put out there. And we talk about how to do it appropriately and so forth. And we instruct a lot on civility. But we definitely tell them that they can make these kinds of criticisms. But the lack of the First Amendment doesn't stop there. In the same 2019 survey by the Freedom Forum Institute, 21% of those surveyed could not even name one right, not one, that is guaranteed by the First Amendment. And that was an improvement over 2016. In 2016, that same survey found that 40% of 1,000 people that were interviewed, that were surveyed, could not name one right guaranteed by the First Amendment. There was a big improvement, right? But from 2016 to 2019, it jumped by 20%. And frankly, I think that we have the Donald Trump administration to thank for that, which is a good thing. But when participants could name a right, the good news was what they did name as the first right that they knew was the right to free speech. The second right, I believe, was the right to freedom of religion. About 54% could name the right to free speech of those who could name the right, a right. The other thing that was interesting about this forum, about the survey, was a majority of participants, 65%, believe that social media companies violate users' First Amendment rights when they ban social media accounts, just like what happened to Trump after the insurrection when he was banned from Twitter and from Facebook. People do not have the basic understanding that the First Amendment applies to the government. You can't sue unless there's a government actor. You cannot sue unless the government is involved. 65% of the people had no idea about this. And I think we also saw this happen after Trump was banned. There was all this stuff on social media and in the news about it that people didn't understand this. One more statistic from the 2018 Knight Foundation survey. Only 64% of high school students say they have, this is in 2019 now, say they have taken a class dealing with the First Amendment, 64%. In 2016, just 3 years before, 68% had said that they had taken a First Amendment class at some point. And in 2006, 72% said that they had taken a First Amendment class. So we have seen a drop of 8% of students who have studied the First Amendment at all over the last 15 years. Well, once I got into these high schools, we decided, and Arthur asked me to speak at this conference, I decided to just do a little anecdotal survey. This was actually done in 2019 because of COVID. And we were at 4 high schools at that time. We were at a very affluent suburban high school. We were at a middle class, sort of small, middle-sized city high school. And we were at a suburban middle class school. And we were also at an urban, more socioeconomically challenged high school. So the results of this came out of 4 high schools. 140 students responded. And we asked a few questions. These were all, by the way, 85% of the respondents were either juniors or seniors. So 16, 17-year-olds, maybe some 18-year-olds in there. Of these students, 39% identified as liberal, 32% identified as conservative, and about 29% right in the middle, moderates, we'll call them. 53% of these young people said they probably were most influenced with their political ideology by their parents, 53%. And their peers accounted for about 32% of who had influenced them in terms of their ideology. One of the things that we asked that I thought was interesting, we said, do you feel like one school of thought, either political, cultural, or religious, is promoted more than another at your high school? 65% of all the students said yes. 35% of the students said no. And when they attributed like who was promoting this thought, about 29% they said were students promoting this thought, 11% were teachers. That was actually the smaller amount. And so we followed up with some other questions that were just sort of open questions. And the question to them was, what would you do to provide more of a balanced diversity, openness in your school, so every student could feel comfortable expressing their viewpoint regardless of what it is? And we just left open the question and to see what kind of responses we would get. So when I looked at the responses, I split this between what some conservative students said and what more liberal students said. And there were differences here. And I'm just going to read you some of the responses because I think some were interesting. One student said, "I would not punish students for speaking their mind. This is literally the only class, meaning the First Amendment clinic, that I have ever felt that I can express my viewpoints without getting in trouble or tattled on." And this was a conservative student out of a sort of a small city high school, middle class high school. Another one said, "We have to be more vocal and confident in sharing our beliefs. Don't be afraid to talk about it." Also another conservative student. Another one, "I feel like not making sensitive subjects so public and keeping them where they are is a better solution than projecting them to the public, because this leads to the administration forcing one viewpoint onto the students and a greater division within the student body. So rather than have a debate about something, if it's controversial, we're just going to keep that under the rug. It's safer for students." One of the things I noticed was that the conservative students, when they were making proposals for how can we have more of a balanced viewpoint in our school, many of them proposed clubs. And they had answers like clubs and ways for students to get involved with their beliefs, establish clubs with an open and non-judgmental environment where students can express their views without fear. More clubs specific to viewpoints, so students who share the same interests and viewpoints can collaborate. And I noticed in the more liberal students who wanted clubs wanted like a polytheistic club, because I think that there was some religious oppression at that school. So the conservatives seem to lean into wanting clubs where they could find each other, where they kind of could find their tribe, right? Where they might have felt otherwise perhaps lonely or perhaps even ostracized. The more liberal students, curiously, some of them wanted clubs, not as many, but a whole full of like 11 students of these 140 respondents mentioned clubs. A lot of other students mentioned that they wanted something integrated into classes. One student said, start reading world literature at a younger age. There shouldn't be just one or two classes that focus on world literature, and then all of the others only focus on European and American literature. I would allow more open discussions in class, said another student. I might consider offering more restorative justice circles. Another more liberal student, maybe we have more societal-based assignments that will help us to form our own educated views and opinions, or making current events a required class, or offering a current events #2 that I could take, because apparently they had some other current events class, but they want this to be a required class. Another student, I think if we should be able to express our feelings in class and be able to talk to others with different viewpoints and still be civil. We shouldn't react in a bad way when people don't have the same opinion as us. Let people say what's on their minds unless it's negative towards someone. We should have more classroom discussions on controversial topics. Someone else suggested more debates. But over and over again, what I saw was, how can we include this in the classroom? And not just necessarily just rely on extracurricular activities. And that was coming more from the liberal students. And to Connor's point yesterday when he was talking about the anonymity, I had one conservative student that said, why don't we have some type of an anonymous forum? So students are thinking about this. A liberal student said, how about anonymous letter readings over the public announcement system? That would be reasonable, the student said. It was a selection, again, nothing like a scientific survey, but I thought it was interesting just to group it according to ideology to see where the students sort of fell. And I have to say, when I looked at this, I really agreed with the students that we have to incorporate the teaching of the First Amendment and free speech rights in more areas of the curriculum. Just don't leave it to the government class, because they're not getting enough of instruction about it. They do not know enough about the First Amendment. Let's teach it, of course, in the journalism classes and of course in the government classes, but why not teach it in English classes, art classes, theater classes, debate classes, forensic classes? Speech is created in all of these classes. The First Amendment is implicated in all of these classes. Maybe we should be teaching this across the curriculum rather than just sequestering it to a government class in your senior year when you take civics. The idea here is to teach the protections and the broadness of free speech rights, but we have to teach its limitations too, that you can't tell lies or publish falsehoods about someone on social media because it's defamation. And it doesn't make it legal just because you slap "it's my opinion" on there. That doesn't mean it's still not defamation. Let's teach them that the government has to be involved for free speech rights to be implicated here, for the First Amendment to be violated. Let's teach them that you can criticize your school principal on social media, but you must do it in a respectful, civil manner. But then if we did that, we'd have to assume that they can actually understand how to have civil face-to-face discourse. And I am suggesting that this is a really dulled skill, dulled by the communication mode that is so popular with teenagers. A 2018 Common Sense Media Survey showed that 61% of teens, listen to this, preferred texting or using social media over face-to-face interactions. 61%. Only 32% preferred face-to-face communication. In contrast, about 6 years earlier in 2012, 49% preferred talking in person and only 42% preferred tech-driven communication. 70% of teens acknowledge that they are on social media multiple times a day. 16% have acknowledged that they are on it constantly. So these teens who later go to college are not learning the primary form of communication for our species, how to talk face to face. They are not learning basic communication skills. When teens used to talk, when many of us, I'm sure when we were younger, we'd meet up with our teenage friends and we would go to the mall or we would go to McDonald's and over a Coke and a burger. We used to have these sort of seemingly airy, aimless conversations, just random conversations that, for many people, when you listen to teen conversations, like, what are they talking about? Seems to have no flow, no particular point of it. But in fact, there's a really big, important point here. It's these real-time experiences of these type of aimless conversations with teenagers where they learn if something has been received or how well it was received by the listener that they're talking to face. They can learn, was it funny? Was it confusing to this person or offensive, depending on the friend's reaction? They can judge a friend's facial expression, the body language, their emotions. They make eye contact with the person. So if you're talking to a friend and your friend suddenly starts biting their lip, you might think, did I say something to really make this person anxious? And then after that interaction, you might say to yourself, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Instead, maybe I should have said something else. Well, this might seem like a fleeting moment, but it's a really important teachable moment. It cultivates reflection, right? So as people get older, as these teens get older, they will learn to say things better, less bluntly, less dismissively. They will say things with more respect because they have watched how it lands on the person they're talking to. They learn the art of civil discourse because they have practiced it in person, face to face, many, many times before. But when you don't have face-to-face interactions, you don't learn how to say something so it can be received, or even it can be heard. So you say things often then you shouldn't have said. You say things maybe cruelly or bluntly. You say things that cause anger and pain. They don't land well with the other person. And often for teenagers who don't get much face-to-face interaction, they don't even realize the effect they're having. Hence, we see all this vitriol, hate, hostility on social media. Social media is a good place for bragging and for judgment. But as a communication platform, it makes us worse at listening and it does not help us understand humility. So now we have 61% of teens preferring to text or Snapchat rather than talk to someone in person. And I just have to give you an anecdote with this. I've seen this in my own family. My daughter right now is 21 years old. And when she was younger, she and her sister in the house, they would be in separate bedrooms right next to each other. We're not talking like one daughter in the bedroom, one daughter in the basement. They wouldn't go next door to talk to each other. They would text each other, sometimes for an hour. I couldn't believe it. I was like, what's wrong with you? Just go in and talk to your sister. No, I'm fine. I don't want to talk to her. I'm good. I have seen my other daughter do this with friends, that they'll sit like across the room and text each other, just like in a nearby room. It's bizarre to me. But really, this is like really common behavior with teenagers. So now we have, as I said, 61% who would prefer to Snapchat or text someone rather than talk to them face to face. And after a year of COVID isolation, when we have only been able to communicate by these electronic screens, I'm sure that 61% will go up, right? Because this is all they're used to now. So now we're producing people who don't know much about free speech protections or limitations, and they don't know much about how to engage in verbal free speech or how to do it in a civil, respectful way that would feed that robust marketplace of ideas that we like to call America. The intersection of these two failures creates a very big problem. It will result in these young people going on to college or life, wherever they go after high school, and they won't know to have these kind of verbal interactions when they're faced with people. What will they do when they're faced with people who don't think the way they do? Are these interactions likely to be intolerant, hostile, defamatory, one-sided? Likely, yes, okay. They're not likely to be accepting or curious of differences because they didn't experience enough of it. They're not likely to be able to participate well in civil discourse. So what do we do about this? Besides teaching free speech principles in high schools, as I was mentioning, let's get this through the curriculum. Let's talk about the First Amendment in all kinds of courses. Let's actually stimulate talk and discussion about this in forensics courses, theater courses. That's one way to teach the First Amendment. But a lot of students were saying, I want to learn this, but there doesn't seem to be the opportunity to, even like to meet other people like me and discuss. So let's sponsor discussion of differing viewpoints throughout the curriculum in government classes, as I said, English, debate, etc. Because if we want civil discourse in college as adults, if we want diversity of viewpoints and to be able to show respect for them, it must start very young. And it's not going to start just when we're in college. We have to start this at least by high school, perhaps even younger. And that's really what I'm offering here. That's what I have seen in high schools. And when I put this together, when I was thinking about what to say, I didn't just think about my own experience. I actually went and talked to a lot of my law students who I've worked with, and they've been in the high schools. And they were talking to me about how alarmed they are that students do not understand what the limitations of free speech are, or that they have free speech rights. And they really don't understand how to talk to each other. So this wasn't just for me. This was like actually talking to my law students who have been in the high schools, talking to high school students now over the last 11 years. And it's also been observations of my own family life with my daughters to some degree. So those are some, that's what I'm positing.
Thank you very much. Jonathan?
Thank you, Nancy. So my comments will, I think, complement many of the things that you were talking about. I do have a few slides, so I'm just going to share them here. Just one second. Okay, what is to be done? So first, let me say, it is a real honor and a privilege to come after 3 days almost of rousing conversation and kind of give some bookends and make some sense of the things that we've talked about and ways that I see for higher education and for people who care about free speech in general to come together and to move forward, to take action. A few points I wanted to make to preface my remarks. So the first is that I'm going to be trying to approach quite conscientiously the field that we've been discussing for 2 days from a place of maximal respect for all of the people who are commenting on it or who work on campuses and who some of whom have found themselves on the front lines of these controversies, and trying to be sympathetic to them and trying to respect the places or intellectual traditions from which they approach all of the things that we've been talking about. So that's first. The second is, that my sense, I kind of alluded to it yesterday, and I've been listening to many of the conversations today and wanting to jump in at many points, but figured I would save it for when I could just, integrate it all now. The second is that I really think often when we're talking about free speech on campus, we aren't talking about one problem. We're really talking about what's better thought of as a meta problem, or the intersection of numerous problems at once. And so it requires grappling with the complexity of that. And I'll try that a little bit. And then third, our object, the university, the college, higher education system. My own academic training was in organizational and cultural sociology, and I'm heavily influenced by many of the people who went in to study universities as things and came out kind of bewildered by what they are and how they work. Maybe most famously among them, Lawrence Vasey, who wrote The Emergence of the American University, reflecting on the history of this organization, and was basically totally flummoxed by its internal contradictions, its complexity, and what he called the patterned isolation of its component parts. Others who've reflected on just the realms of faculty have long written about, the two cultures of the academy, or the three cultures. And I tell you, having traversed many university campuses, many different kinds of institutions, and many different entities within them, communities within them as well, that there are many more than only 2 or 3 cultures in the academy, and which impinge upon the problem before us. So before I come to what is to be done, I think it's very important to speak a little bit about the angle from which I approach these issues in my work at Penn America, where I direct our free expression and education program. So PEN America, if you don't know, and I'll go through this relatively quickly, is a nearly 100-year-old organization dependent on membership of writers, journalists, scholars, artists, and their allies. Originally, the PEN stood for poets, essayists, and novelists. We are part of PEN America is part of a network of international centers in about 100 countries around the world, and in each country, a PEN center works to the same mission, which is generally to celebrate and enforce the importance of literature and open expression and defend the civil rights and human rights that make it possible. And I would say that we like to say we champion the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. In my own PEN history, there are many ideas that were seeded in the aftermath of the First World War, but it was in 1948 that the PEN Charter was officially authored and ratified by all of the constituent countries. And I want to point to some points in the PEN Charter which I think are incredibly resonant today and really important and valuable for the world of higher education. So one is that members of PEN stand for the principle of the unhampered transmission of thought and to oppose suppression of free speech and free expression. But we also pledge ourselves to do our utmost to dispel all hatreds, to champion the ideal of one humanity living in peace and equality in one world. And PEN also has a significant dedication to free press, opposing arbitrary censorship, and opposing such evils as what was once called mendacious publication, or today we would call disinformation. So today, within PEN, there are many different parts of it that do different kinds of work, educational programs, advocacy programs for writers and journalists in the US and abroad, guidance on issues for journalists and for the higher education sector, and celebratory events in the literary realm. And so it's a very dynamic place with many different parts that speak to different communities in the US and abroad. And want to emphasize here that it is a big tent organization, which means that we really do try to think about issues, whatever the current incident or current issue is, with a kind of richness and nuance, which I think is somewhat unique. In our campus free speech work, which has generally been US facing, we have done consultations and closed door convenings, public panels and workshops with just the gamut of faculty, deans, college presidents, provosts, students, residents, life personnel across the country for the past 5 years. We have reports that were put out in 2016 and 2019, which analyze the issues on campuses. We have developed our own PEN principles and our campus free speech guide, which is free and available online. And we've also developed, since the pandemic, a Free Speech Advocacy Institute, which is an online program which brings together young people to dialogue and debate and learn about the complexities of free speech in the US and abroad. I'll be speaking about each of these elements. All right, so Amna, you said it perfectly yesterday. You said, okay, we know the problem on campus. We need more education. So what are the obstacles when we think about what I like to call increasing free speech literacy across the board? What are the obstacles to some of the things, Nancy, you were talking about a minute ago? So number one, I would say the biggest obstacle is just frankly the death of civics. There has been a huge erosion in how young people have been prepared to understand American history and civic education in the US. This is well known. Civic dialogue is part of that. And social media is part of that. But I think in particular, one thing that we've not paid a lot of attention to in higher education and in the free speech debates around campuses is that most students, for most young people, the transition from high school over that summer to college orientation is vast. It's significant. You're going from a setting, think of an institutional setting in a high school, where what you wear on a t-shirt to school could get you in trouble. The school teachers, the principals do have some leeway to, as decided by the Supreme Court, to police and reinforce some rules around speech. In college campuses, that's very much not the case. No one is really sitting down and explaining this to people very well. I think a lot of young people have no idea what to expect when they get to college campuses. And I see this all the time when it comes up pertaining to questions about what people can do on the college quad, particularly if it's a public campus. I'll talk about that in a minute. Another big challenge is significant disillusionment. So when you start to talk to, let's say, a group of young progressive activists around free speech, you have to be conscientious of the fact that they have seen or experienced in their own, just in the past year, on the one hand, Colin Kaepernick, who kneels in the NFL and is essentially blacklisted from it, and on the other hand, they're looking at social media and they're seeing vile TikTok posts of people pretending to reenact George Floyd's death for fun and amusement, and facing no real consequences whatsoever. Now, of course, to a legal mind, to somebody who understands the First Amendment, you could explain to them well, how one kind of free speech is not like another. But often in these conversations, people have deep personal experiences, especially young people, where they have some experience with free speech which has possibly soured them on the concept. And once that has happened, it's difficult to bring them back. You also have many young people who, for example, might be disillusioned with government concerning, for example, gun rights. Thinking of the Marjorie Stoneman activists, who really don't really want to get into conversations around free speech, etc., when they view, for example, like the speech of the NRA as having been so protected and so vastly impactful. And so for many people, it's very personal. On the other hand, we have some students who arrive to college campuses, and of course, it's difficult to generalize around a whole generation, who come in with, if they come in with an idea of free speech, it's very absolute. It's exactly as Nancy said a minute ago, I can say whatever I want, it's my opinion, it's free speech, it doesn't really matter. And so sometimes you have understandably a significant clash where someone who might be wanting to engage in very abrasive or abusive speech without any concept or reflexivity around how that might be received, without much respect for other people, and then other people who might want to counter it, but the discourse of free speech is one from which they feel particularly alienated. What about among faculty? So when we think about obstacles to free speech, supporting free speech among faculty, I can tell you that faculty are widely divergent in their intellectual traditions, what they've read, what they've studied. There really is increasingly little, actually, that binds most faculty. You could say, okay, maybe most faculty have read, I don't know, Karl Marx, but certainly not across the sciences or across other things. And then there are many faculty who maybe have never read it or studied it and yet have plenty to say about Karl Marx. And we encounter that all the time. So there's diverse intellectual traditions. How do you hook into that? How do you make free speech make sense to that? It's very diverse. It's a challenge. The civic role of faculty, similarly, has not only, I mean, I wrote here not incentivized or rewarded, but the truth is it couldn't be farther from mattering whatsoever to most faculty, particularly at research institutions. Now, that isn't to say that faculty don't take their role in guiding people as important, but that's different from what I mean when I think of a responsibility of a professor to have a civic role in our democracy. That may or may not be something that aligns with how they've thought about their work and their teaching, but it's certainly not something that they are incentivized to work on or to think on or to reflect about when all they are told to do is publish or perish. Adjunctification, this is similar, as I said a minute ago, to the disillusionment of many faculty. Something like 75% of faculty today are in non-tenure track positions. These are people who know keenly that they do not have free speech, and they're quite skeptical of why they should bother to reinforce the concept for their students or for the campus in general, because they feel like they haven't been given it. It's a source of tremendous skepticism. What about online harassment for many people, for many faculty in the past few years? They may not have experienced it themselves, but they've seen faculty who, put out a really good op-ed that they thought, or took on a cause publicly, or faculty maybe who just wrote an academic journal but was picked up by some kind of site meant to slam them and target them for general hate, and they've seen little action or activity to support faculty who experience that. That doesn't make them want to engage in speech themselves, and it makes them pull further away from free speech. And finally, I say that many faculty have some familiarity with academic freedom, by which I mean they have what they deem is enough familiarity, and they aren't really interested in learning more. They don't necessarily know much about the history of the AAUP or academic freedom principles unless they're in a situation where they need them or rely on them. And again, there's not much incentive in encouraging them to engage with that history or discourse more. What about administrators? So I mentioned a minute ago diversity of intellectual traditions among faculty. I think that actually among, as many of everyone here will know, the administrative ranks of universities have ballooned, and people have significant variation in how they move into universities. I often say that actually universities are kind of like islands in a sense. If you think of that with many cascading waves of people who move into them from all kinds of different backgrounds. As people wash into universities and wash out of universities, they really come in with all kinds of ideas and experiences and histories in different sectors. There isn't much necessarily shared intellectual foundation. There's no course that most administrators all take together, and then they all do different kinds of things. We're talking about admissions and residence life and counseling and event coordination and student affairs support of all kinds, residence support of all kinds. Each of these universes of the academy is its own language, has its own language. They have varied cultures, varied traditions, points of celebration. Establishing a shared understanding of free speech has to start to overcome some of those significant barriers. At the same time, at the senior level, you have significant challenges with what might be called the singularity of the university, holding it together. You step outside of it, and people talk about the University of Michigan as a single coherent entity. You step inside of it, and everybody knows that it's not really an entity at all. It's a logo on a shirt. It's shows up at graduation and football games, but what is it anyways? It doesn't really exist maybe outside a coffee mug. It's a field of dynamic conflict and of gossip and jockeying for power. And so resolutions and conflict resolutions and efforts to kind of make the university make sense occupy a great deal of time for administrators. And perhaps as guardians of those reputations, they aren't necessarily guardians all the time of principles of free speech, even if we might expect that they should be. And then I'd want to just highlight that the dynamic array of difficult speech scenarios that many administrators, particularly in senior level roles, have encountered in recent years are really not well contemplated by the First Amendment. I think that when we start to talk about free speech on campus and we're talking about students in a classroom, it's one thing. But once you move beyond that, I mean, we're talking about essentially free speech in a city. Some examples that don't have maybe obvious or easy answers. A resident in a student in a dormitory who comes from a cattle ranching background, who wants to hang a rope on his wall, and African American students who have family members who were lynched in their history. Maybe one of them is sharing the dorm room with him. That student demands that this person take down what they see as a noose in where they have to live. The First Amendment doesn't necessarily tell us how residential advisors or the university or other people who are called upon should act in this situation. Some other examples. How about an external group who sets up on campus in the middle of a quad to deny the Holocaust and engages in conversation aggressively with any student walking by wearing a yarmulke? Is it harassment? Is it free speech? Is it an impediment to the students' sense of safety on campus? How should the university respond to it? What about a trans student who wants to study abroad in a country where they are told that there are kind of repressive rules there about gender expression, and they should probably suppress their true identity and not engage in their free speech? What does the First Amendment tell a university administrator to do for that student? Let's say we have a policy on campus against the heckler's veto, but there are two events that have been scheduled somewhat close together and get kind of loud, and students that both feel like their speaker isn't being heard and blame the other one. Well, what is the obvious free speech answer to this? And we could go on. Let's say there are, I think many campuses have confusing bureaucracies. So I want to invite a speaker and I fill out one form and I think I filled out the right form, but turns out I didn't fill out this other form. And then suddenly some people don't want that speaker invited because they don't agree to it, but I already got permission. Is the speaker being disinvited? Who's canceling whom? It can get very complicated very quickly. And this is just, I mean, as I run in my head, some of the situations involving academic freedom are sometimes very complicated. Involving hunger strikes and student sit-ins can be, when there aren't clear time, place, and manner policies, very complicated. So I just want to honor for a minute that a lot of the concept of free speech in the abstract is much easier to kind of stand by and support than it can be in practice. So what have we done at Penn is really twofold. And one is that we've tried to develop principles and in our educational efforts, help people to understand that there can be that principled stance, that there are these abstract, perhaps, ideas around free speech, and we can encourage people to become more literate in those principles, and that it's not though principles alone. We've also tried to develop practical guidance. So let me talk about first, how do we change hearts and minds? What are principles? Why does free speech matter? How can we make the case? Well, the truth is, Randall in his opening remarks was talking about, moving away from legalism and talking much more practically. Well, I actually think there's a whole range of ways in which you can talk to young people or faculty or administrators about free speech. And legal is really just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond the First Amendment and it's the law and we have to uphold the law, there's moral arguments for free speech. There's the fact that it's a universal human right. There are humanistic arguments for free speech concerning the need, the fundamental we could call it anthropological, we could call it artistic desire and need for humans to feel like they can express themselves. There are democratic arguments. There are arguments from history that free speech has been critical to social change. There are arguments from international contexts when we look at authoritarian repression around the world and the imprisonment of people for things they have said and written that can be very compelling. And finally, I think there's an argument to be made a lot of the time that isn't, which is that free speech is essential in supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion, and vice versa, that you can't really have a campus that is diverse, equity, or equitable or inclusive that doesn't have free speech. You can't have a campus that supports free speech that is not one that is committed to free speech for all. And that's difficult. Those principles do come into conflict with one another. What about things from history? I love when I'm teaching students to engage with them with artifacts. And we talked a little bit about anti-slavery stuff, but another area that I find is very compelling for young people that they aren't familiar with is that 100 years ago, most free speech advocates were radical feminist women in New York City and other places, and they were fighting against the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, and sometimes the Comstock laws about obscenity. The stories surrounding Margaret Sanger and her efforts to educate communities about birth control, basic birth control, and just how incredibly difficult that was a century ago. These histories, these episodes around free speech can be very compelling for young people because they haven't necessarily reflected upon the ways in which when particularly women, feminists 100 years ago, didn't have certain rights, how much they felt that free speech would be a means for them to acquire them. One of my favorites, we already had Frederick Douglass talked about, but what about Emma Goldman? Here she is at her deportation hearing in 1919 saying, every human being is entitled to hold any opinion that appeals to her or him without making herself or himself liable to persecution. Ever since I have been in this country, and I've lived here practically all my life, it has been dinned into my ears that under the institutions of this alleged democracy, one is entirely free to think and feel as he pleases. I think that characters like Emma Goldman, Margaret Sanger, some of the others that we've mentioned here can be very compelling as historical figures for people to come to a different understanding of free speech and understand it, our current moment around these issues from a kind of greater perspective. Okay, if you don't like history, you don't like feminism, you don't want to get into that, how about international human rights? I guarantee you, not only do young people here in the United States not know the First Amendment, they have no idea that the past 70 years has been spent waging a very strong battle for free expression to become a core human right in every covenant passed by the United Nations. The Declaration of Human Rights includes free expression. The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights includes free expression. The International Covenant on Eliminating Racial Discrimination includes the right to thought, conscience, religion, opinion, expression, assembly, and culture. The Covenant on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities similarly talks about free expression and as a core human right. This is a very compelling argument for people who have approached these issues only from an American perspective or only through the limited or narrow prism of whatever controversy is inflaming their campus on that day. In our work at Penn, we also have the, I don't want to say benefit, but we do work on numerous imprisoned writers and artists abroad. And we often talk and use their cases to help young people in the US understand free expression in this broader sense. One current case is Xu Ziyang. He is our 2020 PEN America Freedom to Write awardee. He's currently detained in China for the reason for his arrest: subversion of state power. He was critical, in particular, of the government's response to COVID-19. Another case which we use in our work is Mai Khoi. She was considered the Lady Gaga of Vietnam until she angered the censorious authorities, and she's now an expat. She actually came to our summer program for students last summer. She talked about her experiences in Vietnam. She actually also played a song about called Re-Education Camp, in which she criticizes the way in which the Vietnamese government acted in an authoritarian way in her case. And it was very compelling. And through cases and experiences and meeting these stories, these examples from abroad, not only highlight, for example, in Mai Khoi, the importance of international dissidents, the importance of human rights, the importance of free speech, but again, getting at that importance of creative expression as something as core to the human experience. I wanted to quickly gesture to some books if people are interested in trying to look for resources that I think can help to start to change and complicate people's understanding of free speech. One for young children, which is out now, Your Voice is Your Superpower. A new one called Free Speech and Why You Should Give a Damn, which has just come out by Jonathan Zimmerman. And for the more academics in the crowd, Free Speech in Its Forgotten Years, which talks about some of these free speech cases from 100 years ago by David Raban. It's an older book, but a really good history of that period. Okay, so that's our sense of we can, try and engage young people around principles, get them to say, okay, to believe in the Voltairean or not really Voltairean comment. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. They believe in it. They know free speech was a thing. But the next thing for many audiences, okay, I understand the importance of free speech. I believe in it. But what do I do when somebody hateful comes to campus? What can I do in that situation? And this is where I've not only tried to develop principles and ways of communicating the importance of free speech and increasing free speech literacy in a general sense, but also developed practical advice on our campus free speech guide, which addresses a number of difficult and varied, complicated situations for students, faculty, and administrators, where what we've tried to do in consultation with some of the people that I mentioned on campuses across the country, develop, step-by-step guidance for people on how to react to or different ways that they could respond to different situations on campus. We also have our PEN principles, which articulate ways of thinking, frameworks, considerations that try to balance tensions between free speech and diversity, equity, and inclusion in a number of different settings: campus climate, concerning different issues, hateful speech, invited speakers, calls to punish speech, faculty speech and expression, trigger warning, safe spaces, speech and harassment, etc. So I encourage you in the audience, if you're interested in looking for a resource, to check out what we have. And if you think there's something that isn't there and you'd like us to think about it, some scenario we haven't contemplated, we're happy to. So what about practical advice when you're talking to any of these audiences? You have them weighed in. They've met the international dissident. They've contemplated the history of free speech in a more nuanced sense. Okay, well, but what do they do in their lives? I think this is where it's very important to not just kind of be trying to win people over in their hearts and minds, but you have to find ways to give them tools to take actions in their day-to-day lives, whether it's teaching them how to engage in dialogue, teaching them how to organize, teaching them how to, for example, borrowing from Nadine Strassen, how to fight hate with free speech and not censorship. Well, how do they do that? How do they do that in their lives? How can they talk to that uncle who is sharing false news, misinformation on Facebook? And most importantly, for young people, learn that there are limitations on free speech, learn what those limitations are, and learn how their university, their school, their institution, or society at large can escalate those issues. I think it's always unfortunate when people leave a session about free speech with the sense that, okay, so people can say anything to me and I'm hopeless and powerless to do anything in response. That's the worst way to leave an audience, and the number one way to convince them that free speech isn't an important value. For faculty, we mentioned yesterday the challenge around faculty training. I think we have tried to develop tips for faculty. I actually think in my conversations with numerous faculty, they don't necessarily want training, but they actually really do want training, or they really do want opportunities. Maybe we won't use the word training. They want opportunities to talk about and process with peers and other professors how to handle what I call hot moments. Almost all faculty are experiencing this now. Some lectures, some topic that they used to teach one way, but then it didn't go well one time, whether it's one of the top trending taboo topics like race or gender or Israel and Palestine, or something more that a general public would find more mundane. These challenges surrounding speech are coming up all the time. And actually the problem is much worse than it's been well chronicled. If we include anything that a professor thinks twice about including on their syllabus, or any time that a student leaves class uncertain about what the rules for engagement were. I think there has been a tremendous cultural shift, an intergenerational shift that many universities have not well anticipated. And so the point shouldn't be necessarily to train faculty, but I think, echoing some of what Amna was hitting on yesterday, engaging faculty and giving them opportunities to reflect on their own practice and learn from one another. Many faculty would like to have methods for intervention and knowing how to handle a difficult situation at the ready. For example, if a student starts speaking in class about, I don't know, replacement theory, what should the faculty member do? Do you be neutral? Do you confront the student? Do you embarrass that student? Do you shut it down right away and close class for the week? What do you do after the class? How do you repair with students? How can you get students to engage in conversations with one another that don't feel punitive? These are all important questions that people want answers to. What can administrators do? I think very important is to not only learn the principles about free speech, but prepare for different situations, talk them through. The worst time for administrators of any kind to try and figure out what to do about a free speech controversy is when it's happening. They are often feel tremendous pressure to move quickly, and don't always have at hand all the right people giving them advice. They also don't tend to use the faculty on their campuses. This is actually quite a shocking thing about this, and what's so different between a traditional organization and a university, which is I have spoken to leaders of a university dealing with a campus speech controversy who have in their law school a nationally recognized scholar on the First Amendment or on higher education law, and they haven't asked that person what they think the university should do whatsoever. They don't even necessarily always know that person works there. Okay. What about campuses that are trying to engage in dialogue? I think one of the untapped resources in my own experience has been that actually residence life personnel do tremendous amounts of training around dialogue and conflict resolution. I mean, residence life is conflict resolution. And so you have these, numerous people on campuses who are ready to facilitate dialogue and know how to kind of listen to both sides and be patient in a conversation. And they are not used or tapped whatsoever in any of the efforts to address any of these issues. They tend to be kind of written off as not having academic credentials, so not necessarily having something useful for the community. So I think there are opportunities to be creative. In our work, we also talk about the importance of universities speaking out, using their voice. And I'm happy to elaborate on that, or you can see some examples in our guide. But I do think that it is important when that we recognize that just because just because speech can be said on a campus, or a speaker to campus shouldn't be disinvited, doesn't mean that the university can, essentially say, well, it's free speech and we could do nothing about it. I think that it's very important that they demonstrate and model just what can be done about it. Finally, we have to recognize that there are going to be numerous cases that require judgment calls. At the end of the day, some of the thorniest situations around free speech on campus aren't clear cut. They aren't necessarily black and white. There isn't always Supreme Court precedent. And so what we've tried to do is develop a framework for people who work in higher education to kind of not necessarily check the box, but make sure that they're looking at the problem in front of them from three different angles. One is the law and policy angle, the First Amendment angle. Two is a sense of what I would call like the academic angle, which is, well, we are an academic institution. We have academic freedom. We're an educational institution. And so, for example, the extent to which we should punish students who engaged in a protest, should bear in mind the fact that we're here to help students, become fuller citizens. And then finally, the community consideration. How does our university respond to this? Reflects on our community, our town-gown relationships, and our sense of diversity and future recruitment. So thinking through a lot of the scenarios, whether it involves a faculty speech or a student protest or a campaign to get someone disinvited, through these multiple angles, I think could be very useful for administrators. I think these situations are often difficult. I included this one here just as an illustration. We've seen a lot of anger around biased response teams, and I think that a lot of these teams and systems, when they were created a few years ago, I don't believe that these were created from a place of vindictiveness, but to a certain extent, not by people who were familiar with free speech, right? Again, this problem of not tapping into the resources of the university community properly. So what is it that universities can and can't do when it comes to bias and hate? Many universities feel tremendous pressure by their students to do something. So one thing they can do is, of course, you can have a system for people to track or record or, for a kind of support line if somebody feels that someone on campus has uttered hate or bias toward them. What you can't do is create a system that is a pseudo disciplinary universe acting on its own that can punish people for their speech. You can educate people about how to be conscientious with speech, but you have to be very careful how we are in any case in any part of the university penalizing people for speech that is speech alone. Similarly, I think there's been a lot of circulation of what are called these inclusive language guides that universities often don't know what to do with them, or suddenly they're condoning them and they're not sure. I think it's very important that universities understand that it is not their job to adjudicate every evolution in language, and that actually the evolution of language, as much as we might find it perverted, Nancy, the evolution of short phrases in text messages that young people are just so inclined to do, unfortunately, that is a trend that is happening and it can't be stopped. But also to recognize that there is tremendous power in the reclamation of words, and that has been the story of the 20th century. Is not actually, as much as we have seen, the kind of continued rise of hateful words, but there is many instances when communities have reclaimed those words and used them as sites of power and to gain more power. So I think that in general, when I think about the campus that has free speech for all, it's a combination of multiple things. Education is part of them, preparation, dialogue and listening, and having core values that the university can cling to. Moving forward, I think no question that we need greater education for the rising generation, as I've spoken about today, more creative approaches. I think we have to be able to not just model kind of a fealty to free speech, but modeling also how we can be respectful in our disagreements. We can't model that enough for some people. Important to recognize that many situations have much more nuance and require judgment calls, and sometimes people get judgment calls wrong. You have to admit sometimes when you do, but there are judgments that have to be made. And then finally, that it's very important that anyone who cares about free speech be able to stand for some of these principles that I've talked about today outside of politics and call on what we might call bad faith moves. I think it is a missed opportunity right now, for example, and that many who have spent a great deal of time talking about free speech on campus have been somewhat silent when it comes to, for example, online harassment of faculty, or the wave right now of legislative bills that have serious implications for academic freedom in numerous states, targeting based on Trump's executive order on race and sex stereotyping, targeting diversity training. I think that many people who say they defend free speech and support free speech simultaneously have made themselves too comfortable with the notion that we should use the government to silence this effort. I think other efforts to counter it, if people have issues with it, would be more impactful and more healthy for the civic democracy. And then finally, I wanted to point out, wanted to call attention to one of the big challenges in the country right now surrounds kneeling during national anthems. And I don't think enough people, for example, have been as alarmed as they should be about some of the stories that are coming out of Tennessee and Texas and elsewhere where state legislators are saying that they're going to make new laws that would make it essentially illegal for student athletes to kneel during the First Amendment. And these are people who passed bills concerning free speech, not too long ago. So that's some of my thinking, and very open to kind of getting deeper into some of the issues which I had to kind of skirt over today.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Nancy, did you want to comment on that? It wasn't really, I don't know if we're not in the debate format, but did you have anything to add, or should we just go straight to the panelists? Are we still?
Nancy, you'll have to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. I sort of was kind of curious. Jonathan, do you have any cases that have come to you or incidents that have come to you where that had to do with like a censoring of speech, that you thought that basically they were just relying on the fact that the students would know nothing and the administrators could just intimidate? Because that's what I've been running into with high schools, is that they aren't really basing their decisions on censoring either the student press or this type of a thing on law. They base it on intimidation, and the students don't know enough to fight back. And so when they've come to my clinic, we've just had to write a few letters. We're not talking about a legal case. I'm wondering if Penn has experienced that.
Experience with students who don't know as much as they might.
Sure, yeah. And
absolutely.
And they're under the thumb of whatever administrator or department, school department, that intimidates them into silence or withdrawal or whatever it is.
I don't know if if I know people who have been intimidated into silence or withdrawal, but there are certainly cases that I have encountered on campuses, maybe where a student activist says something that, to me, this happened at a university in a southern state where an activist had an account of something that happened, and to me, with my knowledge of the First Amendment, it sounded like I was quite surprised that the university responded in the way that they did to this student, who was a racial justice activist student, concerning free speech. And clearly there was a deficit of knowledge, and I'm being a little vague about it on purpose. But there are other cases where I think student activists, after the kind of maybe what we might think of like the first wave of incidents on numerous campuses, things that happen later in time, there actually has sometimes been a learning and a growth among the students, but nonetheless, they get pilloried in some national media. So for example, at Middlebury College, when there was not the cancellation of and protest surrounding Charles Murray, but there was something maybe a year or two later where a Polish politician was coming to campus, and the students planned a kind of celebration of LGBTQ identity outside where he was going to be speaking, and the administrators canceled the talk. And within, not even 24 hours, there were numerous op-eds. I remember one in the Washington Post very clearly saying about like these students and the snowflake students have struck again. And the thing is, well, the students didn't shut down the talk. They never even engaged in the protest at all. Nonetheless, they were blamed for it. And in fact, some of the students involved had signed an agreement together not to stop the speech in question from going forward. And so there are some moments where I do think students have learned and improved or gotten better or been more, I don't know, enlightened around some of these issues. But nonetheless, they do often tend to get a bad rap either way.
I just want to offer, this one was so absurd. This was in a suburban high school in the Detroit area, where there was a basketball team that was frankly terrible and hadn't won a game, I think, in years. And so the school newspaper would, they would publish how this team did and the loss that they had. And the high school basketball coach decided that this was so embarrassing and was such a bad for the morale of the basketball team members that he forbid the school newspaper to publish anything about the loss of the team, anything about the loss of these games, which was like totally public information, right? And he threatened the newspaper, the broadcast students and also the newspaper students. And he took it right to the top. we finally got a call from the faculty advisor and said, can they do this to us? And I said, absolutely not. And we wrote a legal memo. We sent it to the school board because this absurd issue, and it was total intimidation, actually made it all the way up to the school board in the school district. And they had to appoint like a little independent board to look into the situation. I was like, you got to be kidding me. And it was our memo and it was our involvement in it that settled the whole thing down and said, no, we're sorry to the basketball coaches. You're going to be embarrassed. You have a crappy team. What can I say? But I mean, we are seeing stuff that is, to me, like almost absurd in terms of the type of shutdown of speech. And I'll tell you one more story. This happened in a suburban school in Detroit also, where there was a lot of budget cuts. This happened about 3 years ago. And one very enterprising young student journalist decided to FOIA the principal's emails to find out how these budget cut decisions were made. And so he was FOIAing emails between, I think, the principal and perhaps the superintendent and other people in the school. Well, you know, he's a kid and he didn't quite know how to narrow his FOIA request. So he sent it in and they came back to him and they said, we can do this. We can fulfill your FOIA request, but it's going to cost you $28,000. And we got involved and we said, okay, let's narrow this request to just a certain length of time and principal's emails just between the principal and maybe one or two people who would have key information here. So we narrowed it and we submitted it again for him. And this time they said, now it's only going to cost you $8,000 to have this fulfilled. Well, we ran this up and basically it made it on the Rachel Maddow show. And she reported on it and it shamed the school district in just handing this stuff over. But, you know, if that hadn't happened, we would have had to go to the mat for this one student. And I think this kind of stuff is happening all the time in high schools. And when you are just a high school student and you see your kind of speech shut down or you're censored or you're quashed underneath, you know, an inability to have a FOIA fulfilled, you don't go up to the college level and think that you're going to have that many more rights. And that's what I mean when I say trying to train people at a different level, a much younger level. And if we do it there, I think we're going to see more knowledge and more, I would hope, more diversity of viewpoint on the college campus, or at least that people are trained to think about it more. I don't know.
Musa?
Sure. Great presentations, both of you. I guess I have two questions. So the first one for both of you, I guess, is one of the things that I've really discovered through my work with Heterodox Academy and other things is that, you know, free speech and viewpoint diversity have come to be kind of right-valenced for a lot of students, especially, and faculty for that matter, sort of interpret once the very word free speech or viewpoint diversity they associate with the right, and they associate it not just with the right, but with kind of with defending certain kinds of views that they find noxious, or with kind of as you mentioned a couple of times, it's kind of double standards where these people are saying free speech while they're trying to shut down, you know, things about BDS or whatever. So the whole, like, the word free speech has these sort of negative partisan associations that a lot of people sort of read into it. I'm wondering if you guys have experienced that in your work, and like, how do you kind of get around that? And do you think that it's maybe incumbent on people on the right, especially if they're actually concerned about preserving free speech, to maybe be more cautious in how they evoke that into their political? So that's the first question. The second question kind of relates to the difference between sort of knowledge about free speech and then skills and how to use them. Because so for instance, diversity training, we've talked about a few times, but like one of the reasons why diversity training became a thing was because, you know, in the 70s, 80s, you started having a lot more women and African Americans and other people graduating college. And in the workplaces, people had to, you know, work with people that they've never worked with before, like different kinds of people than they've had to work with in the past. And they didn't graduate from university capable of doing that effectively. So there are all these explosions in workplaces where companies were like, oh, what do we do? And so they started putting in these diversity trainings to help mitigate that. And then the universities followed suit. They followed because everyone in the corporate world started doing it, then universities started doing it. But the point is that the fact that people are doing this training speaks to a sort of failure in education, right? The reason why this training is so ubiquitous, and because there's a real need there, because people are graduating colleges not being able to effectively engage with people who are different than them. And they're coming into colleges not being able, that's why universities want to do it, right? And so how do we, and so in addition to, and you talked about this briefly, John, in addition to cultivating knowledge about freedom of expression, how can we better give people skills in actually using it, which can help reduce some of the pressure that many organizations feel to do these kind of administrative approaches and these kind of training approaches instead of education, et cetera.
Well, I'm happy to take them up. And the question, the situation you describe about people being turned off from free speech, I mean, no question. I have given talks in front of a large room of people before, where there was very clear that there was some of you on campuses are familiar with the room of round tables, but very clear that there's a round table in the back that kind of has only come to kind of scoff with skepticism and kind of aren't really very interested in learning. And I think that it is true that no matter what you do on any topic, there's always going to be that kind of larger circle of people in the world, and there are some groups who you can't change their minds. But I do see that there is opportunities and in my experience, I have seen people, become who are at least a little bit open, right? So most faculty, for example, even if they have become very skeptical of free speech, they know instinctively that there's something about academic freedom that matters to their work. Okay, that kind of like that piece of it does resonate, even if the rest they don't like for whatever reason. And that can be a very that sort of that a little bit openness or a little bit familiarity can be useful for them. I think also in much of our work, what we've tried to help many people do is develop a more inclusive way of talking about a lot of these things. For example, we use the phrase sometimes "free speech for all" as a way of connoting the interlinkages between inclusion and equity and the need for change as part of democracy and as part of the ways in which society has evolved and is changing. And I do think that if you are only talking about, and I would say that much of my experience and the way that I was framing some of my remarks surrounding how to convince people about free speech by using, international examples or history or the UN, etc., is because you have to be armed with other ways of making this argument than just the First Amendment and free speech. Because right now, under the First Amendment and free speech, it's like I said, there is always an immediate example that somebody has of a situation where free speech isn't being upheld, and so they don't see much value in it. So it has become, for lack of a better word, in some communities, toxic. What a huge problem for society right now that it would be, but it is. As to the trainings, we're piloting this year a faculty program, which I had to think a lot about. What was I going to call this? Is it a program about free speech? Is it a program about academic freedom? Is it about diversity and inclusion? I mean, Lord knows I don't want it to be, it's not diversity training, but where I settled in my own language around talking about it is about classrooms for open and respectful exchange. And so that framing, that phrasing, that language is one that I could kind of be comfortable with, and I have found is one that gets around some of the aversions. Now, okay, is the training part diversity? A little bit in terms of thinking about respect. Is it part free speech? Absolutely, in terms of the openness. But by calling it open and respectful exchange, you're perhaps circumventing some of the biases or expectations that people might have in coming into something like that. And I think that some of the best, and I'm sure your experience with heterodox and elsewhere would say that some of the best programs are ones that are a little bit more nuanced and less kind of traditional around either ends of those things.
Josh.
Oh, sorry, Nancy, you had
yeah.
something.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If I could respond, I don't have any big ideas this way. One of the things I do in my teaching, particularly in the First Amendment clinic, because I'll get people, I mean, typically with a set of 12 students, most of my students end up being on the liberal side, but I always get someone who is not so liberal. Well, you know, sometimes we'll call them, like there's one who's a red stater, and it's a First Amendment class. This is exactly what I want, even though sometimes he or she is not well liked by the other students. So one of the things I do is I always when I pair students together in teams, I try to pair them with people they wouldn't otherwise associate with. So one example was, there was a woman who, right after Trump won, you know, she walked in the First Amendment clinic and she had the MAGA hat on and she had the big scarf around her neck, and people would just like sort of loathed her. She was actually she was the best student in the clinic. She was a fabulous student. I matched her up to go teach at a high school with a young woman who was Chaldean, so of Middle Eastern background. And this was all happening just as Trump was putting a lot of his immigration policies in place, and a lot of people were being deported. And the young woman who was the MAGA supporter had very strong opinions. She was very articulate, but she hadn't really lived outside the bubble of her conservative self. And being with this Chaldean student, they never became best friends, but the Chaldean student was having family members being deported. And they had to work closely with each other for the semester because they were teaching together at a high school. And I saw changes in both of them, but I really saw a change more in the young woman who was the Trump supporter, because she said she had no idea, you know, what this was like. She just assumed that these were criminals and these bad people were being deported. And she didn't realize that people were being deported who had been convicted of a crime like 25 years ago that had been a minor offense. And this was like her partner, her teaching partner's cousin or brother or something like that. People change through that. Another time I took a young woman who was from New York City, and she was in my First Amendment clinic, and I stuck her in a podunk, four-corner town high school in Michigan, the last place she wanted to be. But she had to learn how to speak to students who'd never been or really cared to go to New York City. And it was really a good experience. And I think, like, can we mix that up somehow in our classes or in our programs to make sure that we introduce our students to something they otherwise wouldn't have any contact with, and we require them to do it? I think that helps in getting some type of dialogue going.
Okay, Josh, now it's you.
Sure, great, thanks. So mainly for Nancy, first of all, I agree that reaching students at the high school and even earlier level is crucial for this, that if you don't start doing this until college, it's probably too late. But a few questions. One, what do you do about teachers themselves? I do a lot of seminars, professional development seminars for high school teachers, often on the First Amendment, and I routinely encountered just real, both lack of knowledge, but then also dissatisfaction with free speech jurisprudence. Many of them are often seem quite angry, actually, at the fact that the First Amendment protects speech that they don't like, and they try to push back against it. And so how do you reach the teachers themselves, beyond just the students that you have through MSU? What can you do to actually change the hearts and minds of these teachers? A second question, you said that students feel like they can't criticize school administrators online and those kinds of things, which you've said is wrong. And in general, I think I agree, but in some sense, isn't it correct that there's just been so much confusion about the status of online speech, conflicting precedents or decisions among the circuits, that we don't actually know what students can and cannot say online, and that in fact, administrators have used the substantial disruption component of Tinker to, you could say legitimately, given the status of the law, but overreach perhaps in applying that to student speech. And so then if that's the case, what's your hope for the Mahano versus BL case that's just been accepted by the Supreme Court? What's the ideal outcome for you for trying to reach students in K through 12 education. And then finally, you gave the example of the student newspaper. I would have thought that Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer would have allowed the school, and again, doesn't mean that's the right thing, but doesn't the school actually have the authority, as long as it's not been deemed a public forum, to actually regulate what gets reported, as long as they say we just don't want it? So those are my questions.
So 3 questions. Let me take the last one. We try to work with school newspapers to push beyond what is a non-public forum and to become a limited public forum. And there's case law out there. Specifically, we actually have a great case in Michigan this way that says you become a more limited public forum by moving beyond the curriculum. So maybe you have your students, you don't just have newspaper students doing this reporting and writing, but some of the students are selling ads. And so the newspaper then isn't solely supported by the school funds, but it's supported by ads. It gives more freedom to the newspaper that way. Do they have prior review? If they don't have a regular practice of prior review of the principal, then they could be deemed to be a limited public forum, and therefore they have more press freedoms. Are the students really making the sole editorial decision on what goes in that newspaper? And is their faculty advisor just strictly a guide giving them opinions, but she or he has no control over what goes in that newspaper? So there's a number of different things that we can push student newspapers to do where they can become limited public forums. And then there is lesser regulation that can be imposed by the high school principals. It's not easy, and you have to have people to stay on top of that, but it's possible. They don't have just a blanket, like we can shut you down. That's not true. I was trying to go back, that was that question. Oh yeah, okay, social media speech. It's interesting. That's my sort of mini expertise of social media speech for students. What can be shut down, what can't be shut down? Okay, the high water mark for student speech was Tinker in 1969. And then there's just been one restriction after another that's been placed on it. And you're right about the long arm of Tinker now stretches off campus in terms of social media speech. And so administrators could possibly shut down and penalize social media speech that causes what we call a substantial and material disruption on campus. But then there's limitations to that. What is a disruption? It has to disrupt the learning environment of campus, for instance. You could sit and actually say, in these cases have been there, you could criticize a teacher to say, I think this is an awful teacher who's teaching my math class. I haven't learned a thing. But if you go into some type of defamatory, or worse actually, what they find is that so many students threaten, they make this kind of threatening speech to kill, to shoot, to use a knife and hurt someone. They can shut that speech down if it's targeted violence and it's seen as not hyperbole. They can shut that kind of speech down. And that's where a lot of administrators go when they say that it's not so much a substantial disruption as much as this is targeted violent speech, right? It goes against the student welfare. It falls under the Morse case. The Morse case was the Bong Hits for Jesus, that banner that got unfurled up in Juneau, Alaska, and that was shut down where they said you can't promote illegal drugs, or you can't promote drugs that are illegal on student campus. It's bad for the student welfare. Well, the Alito concurrence, it was a plurality decision, and the Alito concurrence stretched that out to say, well, let's talk about what's good for the public welfare. Maybe we shouldn't be able to allow students threatening any kind of violence. So there's been a big shutdown, a big pressure since Columbine because of the school shootings. There's been a lot of pressure in really curtailing student speech. So what we try to teach students is, you can make a complaint. You can say you don't like something, but you can't threaten somebody. You can't say a bunch of falsehoods about somebody, but you can say straight speech like, I haven't learned anything in my math class all year because I think Mr. Smith is a lousy teacher. You can say that. You can put that out there in social media. And unless it somehow creates a substantial disruption, which is that kind of speech is kind of rare, that's legal speech. They can't shut that down. What tends to happen is that the schools get embarrassed, right? They get embarrassed and they shut the speech down out of embarrassment, just like I suggested with this, with a coach saying, I don't want to see that my team has lost 5 years in a row every game and they have these like terrible scores. More speech gets shut down by schools, not because it's not legal speech. It gets shut down because they're too embarrassed to have the speech out there, okay? And the first question was about the faculty members. So this is a problem. This is a real problem because the students have more free speech rights frequently than the faculty members do. And specifically, if you're a faculty member who supervises the student newspaper, say, they put people in this role and they want that person to be an advocate for their students and to teach them free speech rights and to advocate for them, but they don't give any protections for that faculty member so that if the students want to print something and the principal doesn't want that printed, and they go to the faculty advisor and they said, I want you to shut this down. And the faculty advisor says, no, I'm supposed to be an advocate for the students. That faculty advisor sometimes could be at risk of their job. Okay, there aren't a lot of protections for that faculty advisor. And I have known faculty advisors who have been in that situation and have retired early because they stuck up for this, they stood up for the students and they were ostracized by other faculty members who thought that this embarrassing thing should not be in the student newspaper. That's a problem. They don't have, it's more contractual. And sometimes if they have a union, they can take it to a union, but they don't have the same amount of free speech rights. It's difficult.
You had brought up BLV Mahanoy, and I'd love to know what some of the other people here think about this one, but I think the real danger with this case is that it could mean that campuses, high schools, and university legal offices are watching it very closely too, that they would be empowered to police all online speech of their students and have the power to discipline them for it. I think that's really quite worrisome in numerous ways. But one of the areas which there isn't consensus about what universities, speaking about universities in particular, has to do with the speech rights of admitted students who are admitted but not yet come, and the campaigns to get them kicked out for social media posts from the past, in particular racist posts or sexist posts. There have even been campaigns to get athletes, I'm thinking one in California, kicked off of teams for things that they said in their social media. And right now it's kind of a wild west. There was no one is much talking about this issue, but there was a poll of admissions officers, about 300 admissions officers, and I think it was something like 60 or 70% admitted that this current admission season, they are, with every admissions case, Googling what these kids are saying on social media. So I want you to imagine that at 18, you may or may not realize that that as part of your admissions package, and I mean, look, those of you who are familiar with the complexity of admissions to liberal arts and other big, campuses, kids spend a great deal of the first 18 years of their lives trying to get into the college, or their parents do as well, to discover that their social media posts along the way could now become fodder for not being admitted, and whether they are saying, racist things they feel in their hearts, or whether they're joking around and they didn't mean to, or whether they're just, I don't know, drunk when they did it. Like, who knows about all these complexities, and what should that mean? That there's no repercussions? Should we have some kind of realm? It's just complicated, and there's been really little discussion of it, little consensus, but it is a creeping thing that, in the absence of clear guidance legally or otherwise, or even by university policies, people are doing all kinds of things with that right now.
I have a question from the audience, and I might actually piggyback on this with my own question. I like it so much. Kay Kelly asks Jonathan, how is it that PEN America can argue for the avoidance of hate speech, but still argue for free speech? Inherently, hate speech will select a side of an argument and vilify the other. Let's say a debate were to occur between students about transgenderism or gender theory, and one student only refers to the other using pronouns based on their biological sex, not the ones they identify with. In accordance with PEN America, would this be considered hate speech? And just to follow up on that, can you maybe pull up the Penn Charter once more? Is that possible? There was something very interesting there, I thought, along these lines. I did manage to pull up, so if you can, it's okay, I can read it, but there were two parts to it that caught my eye. On the one hand, it said that members of Penn pledge themselves to do their utmost to dispel all hatreds and to champion the ideal of one humanity living in peace and equality in one world. Then it says Penn stands for the principle of unhampered transmission of thought within each nation and between all nations, and members pledge themselves to oppose any form of suppression of freedom of expression in the country and community in which they belong, as well as throughout the world, whenever possible. So those two things, I think, are simply not coherent in every case. You're going to have to choose when push comes to shove. And so given that, I have the same question. Which do you choose?
So I read that I don't see those principles as in opposition when you are stepping outside of what I would call like the normative way that people talk about hate speech today, which is that if you're talking about hate, you must mean you believe in a coherent definition of hate speech and we should have laws that prohibit it. Actually, our position is not that. We're strongly opposed to hate speech laws. We've written about the importance of not referring to speech as harm and the ways in which that could have, or speech as violence, excuse me. We recognize that speech can be harmful, but we've pushed back significantly on the notion that speech is violence. I think our position is very much consistent with Nadine Strawson's concerning the importance of using free speech to counter hate rather than using hate speech laws in any sense. So I have significant reservations about any notion of hate speech. And in fact, I prefer to use the term hateful speech or speech that is hateful rather than to reify the concept of hate speech as though it could be delegated, given as though we could have a government authority that could uphold that. I think there are huge dangers in giving the power to litigate hate speech to any government. I mean, just if we had Obama, you could imagine an Obama administration signing a law about hate speech in its dying days, and Trump was very quick, and many of his friends, to call the Black Lives Matter activists hate speech. He called the painting of Black Lives Matter on Fifth Avenue hate speech. And so there's no question that if it's actually, we haven't reflected enough on this in the Trump years, but it is actually the lack of such mechanisms that impeded, I think, Trump's worst, inclinations to silence people who are against him. So I read that part of the charter not as saying we stand against hate speech and we believe that, we believe in free speech, but I do think it is possible to stand for free speech and also to stand for respecting other people and to stand against hateful sentiments. Now, of course, my concept of hateful sentiments, your concept of hateful sentiments, we might disagree where to draw the line. I think that's unavoidable. But in general terms, do I think that it is possible to stand for free speech and stand against hate? I do.
So just to go to the example here, which I think is very interesting, it's kind of, this is where the rubber hits the road. One can talk in very beautifully and paint very rosy picture when one speaks in abstract terms, but in particular cases, you really have to wrestle with the dilemmas. And it seems like this really points to a dilemma. So just to spell out the issue, if somebody is using their freedom of speech to give voice to the opinion that gender is not a construct, it's a biological natural reality, and they refuse to use someone else's preferred pronoun, then I think by most standards, they are not being sufficiently sensitive. And so one simply has to choose. Are you going to go about promoting the ideal of one humanity living in peace and equality in one world, or do you allow this person to speak their mind and deeply offend this person, cause division, and suggest even that the other person is unequal?
I don't see what other route you really have. I mean, I don't think you can compel people through some kind of authority to call other people one way or the other if they refuse to do so. And no, I wouldn't consider someone refusing to use somebody else's pronoun as hate speech. I mean, I don't think that that is a useful concept. And I don't think it's going to get us anywhere. At the same token, I think that, yeah, if somebody is telling you that they would much prefer that you didn't call them this name right now or refer to them that way in a respectful way, and you insist that you must call them something else, I mean, this kind of goes more to me to, first of all, I think the notion that we should all, that some larger community should be intervening in every micro interaction is never going to solve anything for society. That like, oh, well, this person called me that name. Is this really that different from when my children are fighting and they want me to intervene in every little moment? No, I don't think it is. I think we have to allow people to sort these things out. We have to empower both sides to, okay, you have your speech, you've had your moment to be heard. And I think that, maybe the resolution here is that these people stop talking to one another if one of them feels so utterly disrespected by the other about the firm nature of their being. To me, it comes back more to the things that Nancy was talking about, which is that if one person is saying, please call me this, and the other person absolutely refuses, well, what we have a problem here is about how people are talking to one another and understanding one another. Now, look, we're in the moment of significant cultural change. The goalposts have moved. I mentioned intergenerational conflict around pronouns. It's significant. It's unusual to many people. It's new. They didn't grow up with it. And for many people, when they say it, they feel like they are violating something in their own, I don't know, mouths or conceptions. Does this mean there are, other ways in which, does this mean that we should have some kind of authority determining that people should be penalized for this? I don't think so. I think that we're going to go much further in finding, encouraging both sides to listen to one another better and perhaps finding other solutions.
Great. Lee, I think we have time for at least one more question, I think. Lee?
I think Bradley was way ahead of me. So I do want to say something, but I have to defer to Bradley.
Brad Jackson.
Thank you so much, Lee. I appreciate that. And thank you to both of the panelists for wonderful papers. I have a question, perhaps mostly for Nancy, but also for Jonathan, which is, Nancy, when you were going through your statistics about how much or little people know about the First Amendment is, of course, very concerning. But I have a kind of a Musa-inspired question about it, which is, how different is that from like forever? When I was in graduate school here at Michigan State University, they had me read The American Voter, a book published in 1960. And in that book, you can learn that the American voter wasn't particularly politically sophisticated and didn't know how the American government worked really. And we're kind of voting based on a funnel model of what political elites were doing. And that results kind of held up for the rest of American political history up until now. And so the fact that a lot of folks don't really understand some aspect of American government that is more or less technical isn't too terribly surprising. However, it is interesting from my perspective, because when I was a young person, the First Amendment and free speech was sort of cool. The dead Kennedys were fighting against censorship in one way or another, or the rock band Jane's Addiction had to put the First Amendment on the cover of their record because their record cover had been censored and things like this. But these days it seems like there are fewer sort of cultural things getting people into the First Amendment as an idea. But I'm wondering what could be done to make it seem more culturally relevant as opposed to an educational lesson for them. In my own teaching, I've noticed that students tend to be a bit more interested in the Fourth Amendment than the First Amendment for various self-interested reasons. And I'm wondering if like more Fourth Amendment education could get them into the idea of their civil liberties in general. And that could be a bridge to First Amendment education. I'm just wondering what you think about some of those cultural educational questions. Thank you.
So two things. It's interesting that you bring up the Fourth Amendment. I was supervising something that had happened at Cass Tech High School yesterday. When we teach our First Amendment clinics there, we get a lot of questions from the students about Fourth Amendment search and seizure issues. And my students were inspired by this. We did this actually 5 years ago. We did it again yesterday. We put together Fourth Amendment workshops. We call them Know Your Rights workshops 14 law students were trained in these workshops, and they went down, well, by Zoom, we went to Cass Tech yesterday and trained 500 Cass Tech students in what do they do when they get pulled over by the cops? What are their rights? How do they stay safe? How do they stay uninjured? And we did this 5 years ago, and it was a huge success in the sense that it attracted a lot of attention. And I wish we had funding that I could do this on a regular basis, because the Fourth Amendment is not my specialty. My specialty is training law students to go into high schools and teach them how to teach. So then once they can do that, they can learn the Fourth Amendment concepts to then teach it. So, you know, that can happen. And we also have street law programs that address these things. But typically the street law programs have been reached out to folks that have young people who have had juvenile delinquent issues, right? Who have been in juvie for whatever reason. And so now we're going in there to teach them certain constitutional rights that they should know. But getting back to this sort of cultural thing, it's, to me, what's been fascinating, because I've been a media person forever, is social media has changed a lot of things, a lot of things. Because before, we were always getting our news from whatever, the New York Times, the 6 p.m. local news, the Detroit Free Press, you know, the local WWJ radio, in terms of, you know, getting that kind of news. So we were dependent on news from other people. But now with social media, in effect, we are citizen journalists, right? We have returned to the point that we used to be at during the colonies, when Thomas Paine was printing up pamphlets and standing on a street corner and passing these things out to people. But now we just get on our phones, and instead of passing out pamphlets on street corners in the middle of New York City or wherever it is, we just put our messages out there on social media. And maybe we do our own little investigations and we put it out. Well, that to me has enormous First Amendment implications. People have to be worried about that, because before they didn't have that capability. We might say something to another person, but we aren't publishing it massively. So now the average person has to worry about getting sued for defamation, for libel, for privacy situations. So culturally, to me, this has come full circle. Now we are back to depending on ourselves in much smaller circles to give us news. We have so many news sources, but a lot of people just look to, you know, what are my people around me telling me? I'm going to take that as the news. So culturally, we do have reasons to know the First Amendment in a way that is more both the limitations of it, but the protections of it, more so than ever, because we have these things in our hands every day that we're constantly getting into trouble with. And the younger you are, the worse it is, because they have no idea what they're doing with it. So, you know, I think it does matter more that people understand First Amendment protections and limitations, because everyone is implicated if you're using those phones to send out information.
We're about out of time, but Lee, do you want to be our last?
Yeah, I guess I'll try. Unfortunately, I don't think I can do this all that short. Do the best I can. They're all connected to me. So Nancy, this is directly directed to you. What do the rest of us do until the better civics training comes along? So, right. So that's, you know, that's one question. I want that over there. And then Jonathan, one of the things that I thought was missing from your list of things you care about and are trying to implement is protecting free inquiry. And that's actually the rest of my question. I really thought that much of the discussion this afternoon missed a lot of the places where the rubber hits the road. So a lot of the discussion, for good reasons, was on these edge and extreme cases. And the idea is to elucidate the principles. Although I wish Randall, I think he's not here anymore. I wish he was here, because I really liked his opening point that, you know, general principles usually don't serve. Everything is so specific that you really need to make a case by case. You know, so I thought that was a really good point. But, you know, Nazis, slavery in the classroom, the sexually harassing jokes, Richard Spencer. I mean, these are just really extreme, you know, way out there cases. most of us are not worrying about Richard Spencer in our scholarship or classrooms. Most of us are just not doing that. So most of us are not worrying about teaching, creationism as if it's a fact. Here are the things that I see in the world I actually live in that are frayed. I think that's the best way to put it. The issues of speech and free inquiry and academic freedom are frayed. And this is just a sampling of places in which it's frayed. It's completely not comprehensive. So I have an article up here titled "The Gender Wars, Academic Freedom and Education." It goes, and this started without, this was first revealed in Alice Drager's Galileo's Middle Finger, about how trans activists were sort of shutting down, shaming, embarrassing, trying to drive people who were addressing trans issues, attempting to do it scientifically, however imperfectly, out of actually doing it. And I'm reading from this article now. The statement "trans women are women," quote, could be assumed to be a polite fiction. Indeed, the claim that a man who is however, the slogan functions not as an empirical statement, but as a demand to adhere to the ontological position that claims about people's gender identity trump claims about biological sex. That is, it's a political move to shut down discussion and inquiry, and this hits the road. So, do trans women have biological advantages when competing in female sports? This, in some circles, is becoming a forbidden topic to even attempt to address. Should 11-year-olds, so this is a moral question, that probably has empirical aspects also, but it certainly would bring in philosophers and legal scholars and people in the humanities. Should 11-year-olds have the right to decide whether to get puberty blockers? Well, if there's no debate, there's no debate. And if you raise it for a debate, you have the risk of being sort of, hounded either by your colleagues or by activists. It's not, these problems are not remotely restricted to trans issues. Are there group differences in standardized test scores? Well, obviously there are, but if you go public with that now, you're at the risk of being denounced, shamed, and tagged as some sort of vile racist. Which makes it kind of difficult to understand what those differences actually mean. And I could do a whole thing on this. My own view is that the tag race science for genetic bases of group differences, that's actually fair. I think that was sort of racist, sort of an ugly racist history in science, and I think it's an impossible question to deal with. But the issue of genetic bases of individual differences in intelligence is absolutely a scientific question. And the current environment has made it very difficult to even attempt to do that. There are, I think, real empirical issues as to whether the particular ways in which any particular diversity, equity, and inclusion program is being implemented. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it overflowing into racism itself? These shouldn't be verboten. These shouldn't be topics that can't be discussed for risk, in my opinion, because of the risk of one's career. Does affirmative action in graduate admissions produce mismatch? And if you don't know the story of Charles Niji, he was fired after an investigation after he tweeted, "Black privilege is real." Now that's kind of crude, and I don't think that was really kind of a wise way to go about doing it. And I'm not advocating, and I don't think that I don't think it captures very much. But the idea that affirmative action has led to a situation in which sometimes students from certain backgrounds are admitted to whether it's college or graduate school, and therefore are sort of not as well prepared as other students. Again, this should not be forbidden. Maybe it's not true. Maybe it's completely wrong. Maybe the only reason that happens is because those students are discriminated against when they get to college. But if we can't discuss it, we can't find that out. Are children of gay parents as well off as other children? I mean, again, this is sort of evaporated from the literature in part because, if you dare to study that, then you're going to have a mob coming after you. Are implicit bias and microaggressions serious problems or illusions of problems because of bad science? And there's just I think this. I just found out about this in the last couple of days. There is, I think, an Indian medical student who was either suspended or expelled for challenging the validity of microaggressions from some sort of diversity training type thing that he was involved. So this is not hypothetical. This is where the rubber is actually, the rubber is not hitting the road with Richard Spencer. I mean, it is a little bit, and that's what makes the news and all this sort of stuff. But I have more. I'm going to stop because I realize we're sort of over already. But the rubber that is the conflict between speech and between academic freedom and free inquiry and sort of, the infringements on it are, for the most part, not counting what campus reform talks about, for real scholars working really in the trenches, is not, it's just not occurring over creationism for the most part. It's occurring in these other places. And I just haven't heard anybody address this.
Sorry, Nancy, do you want to jump in?
Lee, I'm with you on this. I'm not always the popular one because I've always been the one to sort of sit in the middle and sort of say, okay, I can, I've been involved in all different kinds of activist things in my lifetime, depending what decade I'm in. And I was never the one to be the real extreme person to sort of shut down the speech. I don't believe in that. I think the more talking, I don't have an overall solution, but what I do know that always has felt right to me is that what we're missing in this is the humanity of it. I happen to come from a family of 7 kids. I'm the youngest in a big Catholic family, and my brother is really pretty conservative, and I'm not. We're the only 2 lawyers in the family, and we always mix it up. But we have sort of determined that we love each other, and we're going to continue to know each other for the rest of our lives, even though we oppose each other radically on many things. And it has taught me a lot in life about how to be more open-minded and to sit down and talk to people who otherwise I'd look at and go, no, I don't have anything to do with you. And I've learned a lot from that. And so when I say that, what I did in my class, like to put one student with another student who would otherwise never associate with each other, it's those kind of small micro things that you might be able to do as a professor in an education program, because you're the one who said you're going to be the team and you're going to do it. And what do they learn from each other? I'm sure you guys have seen this commercial, the Heineken commercial in the last year and a half or 2 years. You see this, where Heineken brings together people, and they had to build something together. Just 2 people who'd never otherwise meet each other. And they mixed them up in such a way that otherwise they'd kind of oppose each other. They have very different points of view. Frequently they were a person of color and a white guy, and they would otherwise never meet or get along. And they put them together to build something, like a box or something like that, for an hour and a half or 2 hours. And at the end of it, they then say you can talk to each other now, and they give information about each person. And then they put a couple Heinekens out there and they say, it's up to you. Do you want to sit and have the Heineken and talk to each other now and get to know each other? And in most situations they did, even though they were of radically different backgrounds and otherwise probably wouldn't like each other. That gave me hope. It's just a commercial. I get it. How many other people didn't decide to have the Heineken at the end? Who knows? But it gave me hope to do something like that in my own classes. It's a start, right? And if many of us did this, we might generate something in a groundswell way. I don't have an overarching big solution to this. Like I said, start it early. Educate people early, get them exposed to other people early and into talking about viewpoints. And at the college level, let's push people together that otherwise wouldn't be knowing each other.
Lee, can you remind me what was the first question that you had of me specifically?
Yeah, it was just that the free, I didn't.
Free inquiry, open inquiry.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
was missing from your list of things.
No, it was in there a little bit,
Was it?
actually.
Maybe I missed it.
It was in there a little bit, and I do talk about that sometimes. And I share with you the concern that the space for open inquiry has also been impinged upon. It's a kind of a linguistic term, whether I speak about it as open inquiry or academic freedom or free speech. To me, in my conception, all of this is actually somewhat closely interrelated. I do share your concerns that many of these areas of thought, do feel, you have people who feel that they've been run out by the academy, and I think it's even more concerning when universities and their authorities are kind of stepping in to take these actions against people. I think that there's certainly many cases where they have overstepped, and I think that we have to find better ways to protect a space for even, like you said, the dangerous questions, the Alice Drager questions, the some of the other questions that you mentioned. I'll just add to your list of things that we are when we are having this discussion. I think it is vitally important that we also include in that conversation the other things that we have historically not been able to ask questions about, and I would just challenge you to speak as passionately, or at least also include in your list the fact that numerous state governments around the country right now have a list of things that they are passing a law that people cannot say or do in their classrooms. It will soon be illegal for college professors to insinuate, to tell students of, just let's say you are a race theorist and you want to allude to that sometimes white people in America feel some guilt because of their privilege, because of the history of the country, that you will not be able to say that, or you could suddenly be fired for saying that or suggesting it. And so I think that the list of topics and the list of infringements and narrowing of discourse is even more than the ones that you're talking about, and I think we should absolutely find ways to talk about these things and find ways to engage in them and make them all equal priorities. I don't think that I think that there have definitely been cases where this alarming case in Texas where students stormed the personal home of a professor who had previously done work on pederasty. There's numerous cases like this where people are kind of going beyond what we might think of as traditional ways of engaging one another, to intimidate, to silence, to blacklist, to shun, and it is concerning. That said, knowledge questions, research is always a reflection of the culture and politics and power of the society in which it is conducted. That was the case previously. That is the case now. So some amount of cultural change in what questions get, the most air, and what groups of people feel compelled to ask some kinds of questions and take knowledge in new directions. Sometimes I think that some element of that is going to be natural and has happened in generations numerous times in the past.
Yeah, let me just say, I completely agree with I thought, again, Randall nailed this. The government is terrifying. The government cannot be in the business of banning speech. So that he's right about that. You're right about that. The government can't be in the business of banning speech that I despise. So it's just too big, it's too dangerous, it's too powerful. Absolutely, I've already commented this on Twitter to some degree. So I'm completely with you on that. And the last thing I'm going to say, there is a tension between sort of legal protections of free speech and free inquiry. So for example, all of you here and everybody in the audience and anyone who ever sees this has complete freedom to denounce me and report me to my deans for saying trans issues should be studied. They could, right? That's their speech is protected. They're contacting my dean and provost saying Justin should be fired. How dare he? That's completely protected. Completely protected. And yet when that kind of thing happens, it is in deep conflict with the ability of scholars to actually study these things.
All right, let's give
Agreed.
Anna the last word.
You're on mute.
You're muted.
I'm being really greedy. I've got all these wonderful minds. I'm going to present a hypothetical scenario. So let's imagine, I'd love to pick your brains on this. That a small liberal arts college, private, maybe somewhere in the Midwest, that doesn't have a bias response team per se, has this situation where a student off campus, far off campus, is videoed by a third party at a party where alcohol is flowing. It's a short snippet saying something like, fuck Black Lives Matter. Okay. And the college that doesn't have a bias response team, which in my view are unconscionable, those things, nonetheless has a kind of a reporting system, if you will, a communication system, we'll call it. And posts on that communication system that this incident was investigated, determined a bias incident, and the student has subsequently accepted responsibility for breaching conduct, community conduct, guidelines of the institution. Now, this to me, I'm interested in hearing what people think. And this is, remember, this is a private institution, so not a public institution. Where is this kind of situation? Both, I have two questions. In my mind, this situation is a lost opportunity for education of students in terms of what is free and protected speech, because in my mind, this is political speech. It's not necessarily racist speech, right? Because it wasn't fuck Black lives, it's fuck Black Lives Matter, which to me is the same as saying fuck the police, which clearly these days, no one's coming to campus complaining about those kinds of statements being made, and students are making them, and faculty making them left, right, and center, as they should. So could I just pick your brains on this issue? And these are the kinds of tiny issues that Lee is referring to, right? That happen on a daily basis. This is where the rubber is hitting the road daily. And I am concerned about the impact this is having on free inquiry. And now we're really beginning to go into a realm that I just wonder what you guys have to say.
Well, it being a private institution, they can do what they want with that, right? If it was a public university, there might be room to say that this was protected speech. And certainly as a college student, might be different if it was at the high school level, because there's lesser protection for people of minority age. But that private institution, they can do it if they want. Some private institutions, I'm a product of a long line of Catholic schools, and that's where I learned journalism. And I thought it was interesting because we had no First Amendment rights at those schools, but I didn't really get that until I left and understood what that meant. I was encouraged to do a lot at those schools. Now, could I have written things that would have been terribly critical of the administration or, an expose? Maybe not. I didn't really do that at that age. But private schools could also decide that they're not going to take a stand on this, that they turn it into, like you said, an educational moment and have a talk on campus about it and let people air it. That's the other way out. That, that's the whole reason we're supposed to have free speech rights, right? Is that we're supposed to be able to vent these feelings. And if you can vent the feelings, then it won't turn into bloodshed later on down the road because of all the suppression of feelings and speech. I think it depends on the institution.
I'll just say, I think it's kind of that student's right on the weekend at a party to say whatever they want, and that the sounds to me, I share your concern that something a student is saying, I don't know, you said they're drunk at a party and caught on video saying something, and suddenly they're, I don't know, expelled or in trouble or even brought in for such a intensely punitive conversation. I don't think it's going to help any. I don't think that solves any of the polarization in society. I don't think it helps anything. I don't even know that it's necessarily that offensive. You know, how did they mean it? How did they say it? Maybe it was not that way. But you know, I think that those. I think there is always a concern when there are like these vague policy things that people are signing. There's a whole case in Tennessee with a Black woman graduate pharmacy student that FIRE has been taking up, where basically it's just like arbitrary. What they decide is professional conduct in that case. And so, you know, I think that you know, my answer is similar. Like, you know, if people are upset about that, then okay, have a forum for people to discuss it. Empowering some pseudo authoritarian authority on campus to kind of, whose job exists solely to police the videos of students drunk at parties on weekends and the things that they're saying about current political issues. I mean, shouldn't we be happy they're engaging in current political issues? So I mean, I say that in jest, but you know, I think that's one thing. I think if there is a situation though, okay, where it's a little less innocuous, you know, like you're describing an act of violence, a threat of some kind, you know, a group of white students surrounding one Black student and chanting that phrase at them, well, then the context starts to switch. And then does the university, let's say, and it happened in a dorm space, right? You know, it's not impossible to imagine the place from which the university sought to develop such authority, right? It's not impossible to imagine why these things exist and how some of the people who might work in these places might think they're doing good things. And so like the context can switch, and the context is everything. But this is why so much of the time, so many of these cases, I mean, I'm just so skeptical. I've become so skeptical of anything that is based on a short video clip that goes viral, because I mean, as we saw as with that one Covington Catholic student, there's always just more to it. And video is such a poor reflection. Video is one side's truth in any time. And so I think we need to be much more careful and skeptical around a lot of that.
Thank you. These are the kind of incidents, I'm just using this as a hypothetical example to highlight the various ways that I feel like there are very real threats to speech on campus and off campus. And that's where the social media piece becomes so relevant.
I think that in general, just this notion of like things one cannot say, you know, is always a problem.
I think, Jonathan, what you're also saying, I think after COVID, we're going to we're already seeing it now. I mean, we've seen students expelled for behavior off campus because it was caught on social media because of COVID rules. That's not because they issued some liberal or conservative viewpoint, but they just didn't wear the mask at the right moment.
But so, don't you think NYU is going to lose that case?
No, it doesn't matter what they lose, because those students have been penalized already or expelled. So I think in some ways, the technology incursion here is something else. I think to Lee, I would respond more in a way of saying, all the examples you named, you could say, well, sorry, you're going to be subjected to a bunch of people on Twitter disagreeing with you. Isn't that what speech is all about? So I was a little bit confused about all the examples. There were so many of them and they were slightly different to me. But I think, Amna, what you're raising is social media changes a lot of things. And I think no one has any real tools how to say this speech belongs in this space right here, or this behavior belongs in this space right here, and we can regulate it or not. I think that is a really massive challenge. And I think after COVID, this is not going to go away. This whole idea, what someone said earlier, like students can record you in class, everything is recorded constantly. It's also not that comfortable that everything we teach is now recorded by the university, and they're looking into our classrooms all the time. So this whole idea that the classroom was this sacred space where something happened, that's no longer the case. So the total transparency of university behavior through social media is going to be a huge challenge to not over-regulate, which I think that is really a big problem. And I think the whole tenor of this conversation was for the last 2 years, handing people power to regulate is really problematic. People just now have all this stuff in front of them, which they didn't have in front of them, by seeing things that have been recorded on social media. So what do? You're going to say, well, you shouldn't regulate, but other people say, well, you now saw it.
Unfortunately, this speech too has a limit and is going to have to be curtailed at this point. I just want to end by thanking everyone, our discussants, our panelists, our moderators, and last but not least, our keynote speaker, although he may not be here anymore. I want to thank everyone for making this such a hopeful or enlightening event for everyone. So thank you.
Let me